All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to a live stream from Practical Networking. The plan for the live stream today for the next hour or so is really just to provide an informal place to do subnetting Q&A. The idea, or at least the intent, is for you to provide some questions, and then I'll tell you how best to answer that type of questions. I don't want this to be where I just solve the question for you. That's not really going to be helpful for you in the long run. But the intent is to kind of build some strategies and tactics for showing you how to solve the questions yourself, so that if you encounter them in the real world or in a certification exam or something like that, you'll be well equipped to answer those types of questions. So all of this is going to be viewer provided questions, if you will. So I don't have anything kind of prepped ahead of time. So this is just going to be an informal place to hang out, chit chat, and talk through some of the best strategies for subnetting. With that said, if you have any questions, go ahead and pop them into the chat. And as they start coming in, I'll just start picking at them, and we'll set up a lot. Start sharing my screen, and I'll talk through how best to solve them. So it's really all on you guys. Hopefully you guys can. We did an audio test earlier. I think everything's going well. Stream's going well. Awesome. Yeah. So any questions you guys have about how to solve subnetting questions, mention them into the chat room. I know there's a bit of a delay. I think the live stream is about a 10-second delay, so we'll just kind of work our way around that. But with that said, I'll turn it over to you guys. So feel free to throw stuff into the chat room if there's any questions about how to solve specific subnetting questions or not. Actually, and while we're waiting for those to come in, I'm happy to continue doing these if this is something you guys are getting value from. So if there's interest in more of these, feel free to throw suggestions in the comments or something along those lines, just so that I know that there's interest and this is kind of valuable for the community. I wonder if the chat has frozen because nothing. Real quick, just to make sure the chat room hasn't frozen, someone drop something in chat just to see if that's still going. Hello, Omar. Welcome. Abby, hello. Chop, hello. Cool, Earn, just saw it. Looks like it's going. So again, this is going to be you guys are going to have to drive this. So if you have any questions about like how to solve specific types of subnetting questions, pop them to the chat room. I guess we could also run through some subnetting questions. .net.com, that one site that does the word problems for subnetting, a subnetting problem generator. We could also do it that way too. Ooh, reverse subnetting, asked by IP Helper. What do you mean by reverse subnetting? Just to make sure that we are on the same page. Okay, got it. So IP Helper, so absolutely. So that question is essentially going to be how to solve the what I call the 7 attributes of subnetting. So every subnetting question you're ever going to get in your career and certifications is really just nothing more than solving for the 7 attributes of subnetting, which are network ID, broadcast IP, first host IP, last host IP, next network, how many addresses in the network, in the subnet, and what am I missing? I think that was just 6. First host, last host. Yeah, I think, yeah. It's those are the words that I said you should have a definition of in the description, so feel free to look at those. But we could definitely start there if you like. Absolutely, I'm glad you like the playlist. Glad you guys like it. So let's actually just start there with a simple subnetting question. So let me switch to the screen share. Okay, cool. So what we are going to do is just do a random problem from the subnetting generator. So let's see, you guys can see that well enough. So if you go to subnetipv4.com, there's a subnetting problem generator. And that's meant to kind of give you a place where you can just kind of practice subnetting to get additional reps on it. So if we just kind of go through this a little bit until we get a good kind of fun random one we can do together, let's just go with this one. So we're going to solve all 7 attributes. By the way, sorry, I had a bit of a head cold this week, so if I sound weird, that's that. But so we're going to try and find all 7 attributes for this target IP, target IP and mask. So I'll put that in. It's 192.12. Let's do this. Move that there. 192.12.43.200/27. So when given something like this, the strategy is always going to use essentially what the strategy is in the playlist, the subnetting mastery playlist that I ran through. So what you want to do is first figure out your the interesting subnet, if you will. So since we're doing a /27, I know that the interesting subnet is going to be the 4th octet. And again, 27 represents where the ones in the subnet mask start turning into 0, and anything 25 and up is going to be the 4th octet. So this is where I'm getting the 4th octet from all that. And with a 20/27, if we use this little cheat sheet, which I teach you how to use in the playlist, the subnetting mastery playlist, which is also available at the bottom of this page. All these videos will teach you how to do all the subnetting you want. So subnetipv4.com if you want to do that. But just for the sake of stepping through it, we'll do it together. So when you have a /27, this puts you in this column of our cheat sheet. And the group size number is the important one of this column, is 32 for a /27. And so what the strategy is, you start at .0 in the interesting octet, which for us is the 4th octet, and then you keep incrementing by sets of 32 until you pass the target IP. And the target for us, since this is the problem we're trying to solve, is 200. So you'd go .32, so .0, .32, .64, .96, and so on until at some point you passed 200. Now, we'll just continue. We'll go through it. So 196, and then it's wow, my math is failing. 128, 160, 192, and then next would be 224. And you'll notice right there, we passed 200. So 200 would appear somewhere right in there. Once we've done that, we've essentially done all the hard parts of subnetting IPv4, right? At this point, everything for answering the questions it's all super, super easy. Because all you're going to be doing is simply pointing at values and sometimes subtracting 1 or more. So this number right here, the number before what we passed, so again, this is where we passed, this is where that 200 comes from. That 192 is going to be the network ID. So if someone asks me, what is the network ID of this problem right there, 192.12.43.200, I would say that the network ID is 192.12.43.192. And again, I'm pulling that 192 over here. So the number before what we passed is the network ID. The number after what we passed is what's called the next network, meaning that's going to be, we'll do this, net ID, next network. And I'm just going to write the 4th octet to save us some time. The number after what we pass to the next network, what that means is that if we are listing out all the /27s in 192.12.43, the next /27 after our /27 would start with 224. Now that's going to be useful if you're doing kind of VLSM type problems where you're trying to solve, you have a topology and a certain number of IP addresses and networks, and you're trying to say, we want to assign subnets appropriately to this particular network. That's where the next network field would come into play. For this type of problem, you won't need necessarily the next network, but it does help you solve the broadcast IP, because the broadcast IP is the last IP address in this subnet, which means it's the IP address directly before that number. So the broadcast IP address for this subnet would be .223. All I did was I took -1 from 224 over here. So that right there gives us the subnet ID clean this up a little bit. The network ID rather, and the broadcast IP address. From there, excuse me, from there, if I wanted to solve for first host IP and last host IP, all I would do is do +1 to this guy. So my first host IP address would be .193, and -1 to this guy. My last host IP address, would be 222. And so that right there tells me the host range. So if I'm trying to answer questions, excuse me, if I'm trying to answer questions that have to do with like, hey, is this a valid IP address? Can I use this IP address on the subnet? That's where solving for the host range, or the first IP and last IP, would be useful. Any IP address in between 193 and 222 is a valid host IP address, usable for hosts on that particular network. So that's network ID, broadcast, next network, first host, last host. That's 5 things. The other 2 things you could solve for are converting a subnet mask to a Cider notation. And so here our problem gives us Cider, it gives us a /27. And to convert that to a Cider notation, I'm just going to use the cheat sheet. Notice the subnet field includes a .224. That tells me that the subnet mask for this particular problem, subnet mask, would be 255.255.224. And again, I'm pulling the 224 from right in there in the from our cheat sheet. Excuse me. And so the last thing to solve for would be the number of addresses. And when you're doing something in the 4th octet, like we are, the number of addresses actually matches the group size. So if someone were to ask me how many IP addresses exist in a /27, the answer is 32. Now that's total IP addresses. So if I'm being asked how many usable IP addresses, again, we have to subtract 2 to remove the net ID and broadcast. So it would be 32 minus 2 to get us 30. So that's the general strategy. And again, the only really difficult part is this part, adding sets of 32 to pass your target IP address. Once you've done that, everything is just essentially reading the chart, subtracting, or adding 1 as necessary. All right, you're saying my video is covering the top arrow on 192. Oh, I see. Let's do this. There. Sorry about that. My face was in the way. Cool. Cool. So that's how I'd answer those types of questions. Now, we did one, and intentionally I wanted to start with a question where the 4th octet. Oh yeah, it's super easy. So we did one with the 4th octet. It's useful to also do one in the 2nd and 3rd octet. And I think I saw that, yeah, Chop mentioned something about the 2nd and 3rd octet. So the same strategy we used just now to answer all 7 attributes of subnetting for this question, which was the, this question in here, which was the 4th octet, we can use that exact same strategy to do the 2nd and 3rd octet. And so let's do that next, just for fun. Now, it might seem like I'm stepping through this pretty quick. What I would say is, if you want a slower kind of walkthrough of what these steps are, definitely check out that Subnetting Mastery series. In video 3, I go through everything we just did just now, but super like slow and methodical, and explaining every step, and with better animations and better handwriting as well. So if you want to kind of run through of that, definitely check that guy out. What we're about to do next is actually, Sim asked a question. I'm gonna answer that real quick. So firstly, thank you for the Subnetting Mastery for sure. Subnetting making sense, awesome. I do still use the cheat sheet, Sim. To be honest, as a network engineer, you'll do a lot of subnetting in your early network engineering career as kind of a junior network engineer, network admin. And then you kind of stop doing subnetting as much at kind of in the midpoint of your career. And then in the late ends of your career, you start doing periodically more and more subnetting as you start architecting networks and designing networks and whatnot. So what ends up happening is like in the middle of the subnetting career, rather in your network engineering career, a lot of like the ins and outs and the memory retention of subnetting kind of like goes away and it comes back later on, if you will. So to that end, I do still use a cheat sheet. And the cool thing is this cheat sheet is super easy to quickly sketch out. It's just 3 lines, and you know, if you ever need to do subnetting on the fly, you can kind of quickly kind of remember the cheat sheet or jot it out real quick. Yeah, and in the video, I teach a simple way. In the subnetting series, I teach a simple way of drawing the cheat sheet to make that easy. So that is to answer Sim's question. Okay, so with that said, let's do another problem of these where we're doing the second and third octet together. But let me first clean up my slide. And again, if you guys have any other types of questions, something like, you know, how do you solve this type of questions? That is what this session is meant to be about exactly. So feel free to ask those types of questions. Okay, cool. So what we can actually do to keep this simple, so a few things you have to do. So when you're solving second and third subnet, you have to start by extending the cheat sheet. So our cheat sheet ends at /25. You'll notice that right over here. But if you're solving the third octet, you need to add a row that includes /17 through /24. And so the way I like to do that is simply continue the counting. So notice here, I started at /32 and continued down until I got to /25, just incrementing the Cider notation by 1. Well, for the third octet, I'll try and do this super neatly. What I'm going to do is just continue that counting. So this would be /24. Wow, I'm not going to be able to do this neatly. Let's see if I can make this bigger. Sorry, I have a kind of a dull pen for writing on here. Actually, I wonder if I could just do that a little bit bigger. That over here. So that my face isn't in the way. Cool. So /24, /23, /22, /21, /20, /19, /18, /17. Nope. 17. Okay. So that's all you really have to do to extend this to solve the third octet problem. So what we're actually going to do is just take that same thing that we randomly generated earlier. Make sure everything is on the screen. Cool. And we're going to make this a third octet problem. So rather than just make this a /27, we're going to make it something in the third octet. And just for fun, let's go with /20. So I'm going to now make that a /20. So I'm going to show you how you would solve this if this was a /20. Cool. So again, the problem is essentially the same. Since the /20 is here, this tells me I am in this column right here, which means my group size is going to be 16. So that's what I'm going to be using as my increment value. But since I'm in the third octet, and I know this because the problem tells me I'm in the third octet, I'm a /20, I'm going to be incrementing that third octet in sets of 16 until I pass 43. But again, I'm going to start, let me make this a little bit smaller. Yeah. So I'm going to start at .0, and then I'm going to go to .16, then I'm going to go to .32, then I'm going to go to .48. So again, all I'm doing is just adding, starting at .0 and adding increments of 16 to what I'm starting with, to .0. So 0 plus 16 equals 16, plus 16, 32, plus 32 equals 48. And at this point, I've passed 43, right? So 43 would exist somewhere right in there, right in between those two numbers. Therefore, right away, this tells me that right there is the network ID, and this right here is the next network. But since this is the third field, we have to carry down the other fields, and then the fourth octet will be 0. So what I mean by that is the net ID, sorry about my handwriting, the network ID is going to be 192.12, right? I'm just pulling these two down. And then what I've divided is my answer, .32, and then .0 for the last octet. And then the next network, I'll put that down in here, will be 192.12, and then this guy right here, 48.0. That's going to be my next network. And so if this is my next network, this tells me that my broadcast IP address is going to be this guy -1. Now, when you're doing -1, it isn't that you're taking this 48 to 47. You will do that, but remember, this field also accounts. So it's like if I were to give you 20 and I said, do just the number 20, right, in decimal, -1, obviously this number would go down. Like you and I know decimal, the answer would be 19, but you have to account for the fact that this also has to go one lower than it was before. So the actual, the IP address immediately before this guy, the next network, is 192.1.2.47.255. And I go into more detail on that in the video. I think video 6 is the one where I talk about third octet subnetting. And video 7 is first and second octet subnetting. But you'll see the strategy is the same. But in any case, right there, I've just solved for the network ID and the broadcast IP and the next network of this /20. The host IP address would be, rather the first host IP address would be this guy +1. So I'd have 192.12.32.1. And then the last host IP address would be this guy -1. So I'd have 192.12.47.254 as the last available host IP address. So if we were asked, so if a subnetting question came up on a test or something like that, that said something like, is the IP address 192.12.35.0 a valid host address? It would absolutely be a valid host address because it falls within the range, within the first host and last host IP address range, even though it's .0. Since it's a /20, the fact that it ends in .0 is totally fine. It's a perfectly valid host IP address. So that's the strategy you would use to solve for subnetting problems, or the 7 attributes of subnetting problems in the third octet. And again, I go into more detail on all this in the video. So if you want kind of a slower, more methodical, and again with better handwriting run through of this, I would definitely check out that video. Okay, so let me go back to the chat and see if there's any other questions. And again, this is meant to be chat driven, meaning if you guys have questions about how to solve certain types of things in subnetting, definitely mention them into the chat. Let's go back to this screen. I'm looking for questions. All right, so let me catch up with the chat. Cool, glad you found this helpful. Glad you enjoyed it. Absolutely, you're welcome. About the playlist. Yeah, the playlist in a lot of ways is the way I wish subnetting had been taught to me when I was learning all this. It's a strategy that I like picked 4 or 5 different strategies of what other people had taught me about how to do subnetting, and I found one that I liked a lot, and then every time I showed it to somebody else, they tended to like it a lot as well. And so I decided to create a video series explaining how I did it. It's one of the first video series I did, so the video isn't amazing. I'm not on camera. I think the audio is not super amazing either, but it's definitely solid teaching content for teaching how to do subnetting. Okay, let me catch up with the chat. VMware has come up a few times as suggestions for what to do next. If I'm honest, VMware is not my field of expertise, so I don't know if I'm quite the best person to teach that. So I did add it to my list at some point, but there's so much stuff that is within my field of expertise to teach that it's unlikely I'll get to that anytime soon. Cool, so Sim, that gives you the answer. Fantastic, glad to hear. No worries, Fausto, welcome, glad you could join us. Deborah, glad you enjoyed it. I'm so glad that it kind of made subnetting click for you. That's awesome. Congratulations. It's always a big step when you're learning networking, when the subnetting aspect first clicks. It's in a lot of ways the first major hurdle for folks trying to get into the field. So awesome. Glad that that's sinking in for now. So I don't know if I'm saying your name right, but Abby brought up a point about dividing the number by the group size. You can absolutely do that. That absolutely works. In fact, video 5 shows you a bunch of like speed tips for how to do the increment part quicker. I didn't specifically cover the speed tip about dividing. And the reason for that is honestly, it's subjective. For me, my mind doesn't do so well with the division, so it actually slows me down more if I try to go at that route. But absolutely, that is an appropriate speed tip. You could absolutely use that if your mind, if you enjoy the division aspect of not enjoy, if you're good at doing mental division in your head quickly. So that's Abby. Okay, cool. Oh, cool. So say Sashank asked a question about /30s and /31s. That's a great question. So traditional subnetting, yeah, we'll go with that. Traditional subnetting, remember, if you're trying to calculate the number of IP addresses that are usable, you have to do -2. So if we, in fact, let's actually just use the cheat sheet. Let me get it cleaned up a little bit first. Let's go back to here. Okay, cool. So in a /30, the number of addresses that exist is 4, and that's the total number of addresses. So if you're trying to do a if you're trying to add subnets to say, yeah, 2 routers, and you want to figure out what IP address are you going to use here, what IP address are you going to use here, you need at least 2 addresses, one for each side. And the traditional wisdom has been you have to at least use a /30, which has a total of 4 addresses. And you do -2, which gives you the 2 addresses you can use on either side of the link. There is an RFC that was released, though, and I believe this is RFC 3021. Let's see if my memory holds right. RFC 3021. Yes, perfect. There is an RFC that was released. When was this? 2000? That essentially allows a point-to-point link to use, get this out of the way, to use a /31 address space. So a /31 has 2 addresses. So traditionally, if you did the -2, 2 minus 2, that would be 0, and you wouldn't have any IP addresses left over. But what that RFC did, 3021, is it said, listen, if you're doing a point-to-point link, and if you assign a /31, there essentially isn't a network ID and broadcast on that link. And if you think about it, that makes sense, because if you're doing a /31, there's only one other person on that link. There's only me and the other person. So there isn't really a need to have a broadcast address where you can send traffic to everybody on the network if there's only one other person on the network. So yes, you can use a /31 on a point-to-point network. Now, the tricky thing here is at the CCNA level, they might be testing you to see if you understand that you're supposed to do -2 and you're looking at usable hosts. So I've seen, and I don't know about the current version of the CCNA because I haven't taken it, but in the older version of the CCNA, even though this RFC exists, the older version of the CCNA did say the size you can use on a point-to-point link is a /30. So this is one of those questions where you have to sort of figure out what Cisco wants of you. So anywhere in Cisco documentation, especially if you can find something like the official certification guides, if they say a /30, then go with that for the test. But know that in reality, you can use a /31 on point-to-point links. We do this all the time in production, so that's a very common thing. But I'm glad you asked that question. That's a good question. So that was Sishank. Let me know if that answers your question. All right, cool. So catching up. Jeremy, your networking fundamentals videos are the best thing on YouTube. I'm so glad you enjoyed those. I poured my heart and soul to making those as cohesive and methodical of an introduction to network engineering and networking in general. So thank you for recognizing that, and I'm glad you got a lot out of that. For those of you that haven't come across it, what Jeremy is talking about is this series. And you can just find it on my channel. So this series, it's my networking fundamentals series. It's essentially, listen, if you're studying for the CCNA, start here. Absolutely start here. Watch this series. I promise it'll make everything else you study in networking kind of like fall into place much better. This is kind of a run through on how networking works from the ground up, all the way to like what are the devices used, down through the OSI model, down through how switches work, down through how routers work, and then kind of tying it all together with the protocols and how data moves to the internet question. So highly recommend that series. People have really enjoyed that series, but I don't really know how to do marketing, so it hasn't blown up as I expected it to, you could say. But highly recommend that series. Give it a shot if you haven't seen it yet. Cool. So that was Jeremy. Gaurav asked about subnetting and VLANs. There's a lot of overlap with subnetting and VLANs, and to be honest, I don't really like how teaching curriculum puts those two things together. They really are different concepts that are somewhat related, but VLANs are really just about virtualizing your layer 2 domain. So to understand what I mean by that, I would definitely check out the VLANs video on my channel. All you're doing with VLANs is taking one big physical switch and breaking it up into smaller virtual switches. And so anytime you're breaking up in the traditional world before VLANs, I'll say, you're using different switches in different IP parts, IP networks. So using different switches by default meant you had different IP networks, therefore you were subnetting. And if you're doing that individually within a switch, then obviously that means you're now doing your subnetting within the VLAN as well. So it's sort of like two different concepts that create a lot of overlap, but I think trying to teach both ends up being kind of confusing. So in my mind, I would say make sure you separate those concepts out, understand them independent of the other. What are VLANs? What do they work? What are their purpose? And also when you need to actually do IP subnetting, that has to do with how you're architecting your layer 3 domain within your topology. Cool. Okay, so let me catch up on the chat. And again, if you guys have questions about how to solve these specific types of subnetting questions, please mention them in the chat. We've got about 20 minutes left, 20 minutes and change left of the stream before I have to get to another appointment. So yeah, so let's go back to this view while I'm looking for questions. Yeah, so ask any of your questions in the chat. Otherwise, let's catch up with what I've missed. Cool, VLAN, it's layer 2, talk about that. IP subnetting layer 3, absolutely. MMD, good luck with your CCNA class. Thanks for joining. Correct, Wizyak/31 does indeed save many addresses. When you do supernetting. So Abby asked about supernetting. I'm not 100% sure what the question was. Oh, it looks like you clarify a little bit lower. Okay, cool. Awesome, Mohammed. Glad you enjoyed the subnetting playlist. I'm glad you're enjoying the OSPF playlist. That's been fun to kind of work through. Hello, Musa. Welcome. Abby, new subnet register Bear Thunder. Shall we take the big and small IP or the big and small Cider? So Abby, I'm not 100% sure I follow your question. So if you want to rephrase that, I'd be happy to speak to it for sure. Cool, Sashank. Glad that I answered your question. Awesome. Oh, fantastic. In Fun City. I'm glad you're enjoying the Networking Fundamentals series as well. Yes, going into the cloud aspect of networking is very high on my list of things to do. We'll say things are in works. We'll see how it goes. But noted. So Chris Nord asked a question. Yes, absolutely. When an organization picks a private address range, they are subnetting that private address range many times over internally to their network. So you are indeed going to be doing a lot of subnetting with those private address ranges as well. In the specific strategy, I mean, at the end of the day, as long as whether you're doing subnetting in the way that I propose or another way, that as long as you get the right answer, you know, that's what's important. Can you do it? Are you comfortable with it? And can you do it quickly enough to pass the certification exam? This is the method that I've used. This is the method that I've taught, you know, thousands of students throughout my career, and people tend to really like it. So, but if it's not for you, it's not for you. It's totally a subjective thing. It's totally, as long as you can get the right answer successfully. Cool. So WYSIWYG's confirming indeed there are no IP classes. Absolutely. Cool. Yep. You're welcome for the information. Glad you guys are here. Cool. Cool. So Mr. D brought up about CCNA and questions on the CCNA that are not in the exam guide. So two things to that. So one, the actual exam objectives aren't 100% of what you'll find. In fact, I think right at the top of the exam objectives, they'll say something like, this is most of what you'll find, but there might be other stuff. So that's where Cisco is able to kind of sneak in some of the GRP questions or whatever. But I will say some of the things that Cisco does in their testing is they'll throw demo questions, test questions about potentially future versions of the test, or potentially older versions of the test, or potentially different discipline version of the test. So it's like CCNA voice versus CCNA security versus CCNA route switch, or whatever the case. And so what happens sometimes when Cisco throws those questions in, they'll throw a question in that they know is not in the exam objectives, just to see how that question does, how people are able to kind of figure out that question, but they're not actually graded. So it's them mostly refining their test bank questions, not so much giving you a test question that they're going to count against you or whatever. So it is normal in a test to encounter questions that are like, wow, I've never even heard of this piece of technology, or whatever the case. Hopefully that doesn't happen, right? But sometimes that does happen. That's totally okay. My best bet is don't let that get to your head. Answer the question as best you can. Try and infer what they're trying to get you to answer. Again, answer as you can, and then move on. Don't spend a lot of brain stress credits, I'll say, on that particular question. Because if it's a question you're not going to get, you're better off saving that time for the rest of the question of the exam. So that does happen. It is what it is. Awesome, Fausto. I'm sure you'll catch up to us soon. Oh, great question, Jedi. Do I think I would survive in the Old West? I'd like to think so, but I have no idea. Cool. Cool. Awesome. So I think that actually catches us up on the chat. So I'll give one final option for, are there any other types of questions that when you encounter this type of subnetting question, it kind of confuses you? If you have those, mention those in the chat, and then I can kind of walk through the best way to solve those types of questions. If not, I would definitely point you guys to the Subnetting Mastery video series. If Subnet IPv4.com. If you haven't, if you're looking for like a cohesive, full walkthrough of how to do subnetting from A to Z, Subnet IPv4.com. There's some learning videos at the bottom of that, or on my channel playlist, the playlist called Subnetting Mastery. I'll throw that in the chat, just so that it's there. But that's like a complete walkthrough for how to do subnetting from start to finish. All octets, VLSM, FLSM, supernetting, the whole thing. So if you're looking for a resource on subnetting, I can't recommend that one high enough. Obviously, I created it, so I guess you could say I'm biased in that regards. But I will say from the comments, people have really appreciated that way of doing subnetting. So check that guy out if you need. Okay. Okay, Mo had a question about the use of network addresses. Nowadays, network IDs, I imagine you mean network IDs. Correct me if that's not what you mean. Nowadays, network IDs, so before VLSM, you could identify the network size using the first octet. That's classical networking. And so the network ID was something you can infer just based upon the number that was used. So something that was, in fact, let's do this. Let me share my screen. Cool. Share my way. Cool. So this chart, it's from this article on my blog. I'll put the link in as well. But it's this chart right here. But essentially, in the classful networking days, you could infer the subnet mask just from the number used in the IP address. So if it started in this range, it was class A. If it started in this range, it was class B. If it started in this range, it was class C, and so on. And in those days, just looking at the IP address would let you know the mask and therefore know the network ID of that particular network. And so there was thought that a router would get confused if you're trying to use that IP address as an actual host address instead of just referring to a subnet, a bunch of IP addresses. And so they decided that the network ID would be unusable for hosts for that reason, to avoid the potential confusion of like saying, hey, my network is 192.168.1.0 instead of my host IP address is 192.168.1.0. So that's the purpose of the network ID being unusable as host addresses. You'll notice that it's not actually a technical requirement. In fact, in IPv6, they do away with that. In IPv6, you can absolutely use the first IP address, which what we'd typically call the network ID. So it was just done something to kind of spare some confusion in the early days of networking before VLSM was the thing. Now with VLSM, if I simply give you an IP address, it's impossible to tell what the network ID is unless you also have a subnet mask. For instance, if I gave you, like 10.0.0.0/24 and 10.0.0.0/16, both of the network IDs for both of those are 10.0.0.0.0. So you can't just infer what size network based upon the IP address, and therefore it's sort of like an archaic reason why you can't use it that works in IPv4. But in V6, you absolutely can use what we would call the network ID. In fact, the concept of network ID goes away. Cool. Okay. Let me see if there's anything else I missed in the chat. I don't have a series on CompTIA for the Network Plus. Honestly, Professor Messer is really good at teaching Net Plus stuff. I had to teach Network Plus a few years back in my career, and it wasn't for me because it didn't seem to really go into enough depth where I was satisfied with the content. But Professor Messer is really, really good at teaching just what you need for the exam. So it is a lot of memorization. In fact, all the CompTIA exams, A+, Net Plus, Sec Plus, there are a lot of memorization because you don't go deep enough to actually understand how things work. You just have to know a little about a lot of different things. So that's kind of the nature of the beast insofar as the Net Plus exam. But Messer is pretty good. I would say I like my teaching of the networking fundamentals and subnetting better than Messer's, but again, that could be biased, if you will. But I definitely don't have anything where I could point you to say this is how you would learn Net Plus. I would say watch Professor Messer, that is. Watch my Network Plus training series. Sorry, my networking fundamental training series, and then watch my subnetting videos, and then go from there. Well, so Plus, cool. You're welcome. Glad you enjoy this, Shay Shank. Glad this was useful. And yeah, definitely gonna be doing more videos as time goes on. Yeah, agreed, Mr. D. They do have questions that are like legacy networking that's irrelevant for the modern world. CCNA to a lesser degree as well, but they do definitely have some. I don't have CCNP courses. It's on my list of maybe to get around. And that's where some of the more advanced MPLS, VXLAN, EVPN stuff might be involved. Cool. Glad you enjoyed my content. So Abby asked the question again about IP summarization. I'm still not sure I fully follow your question. What I'll do, hit me up on Discord after the fact. So take a watch through my supernetting video, and then find me on Discord, ask me the question. I can try and help you out afterwards. With that said, it looks like we've kind of come, we've actually kind of running out of time as well. So we're probably coming to the end of this hour. So again, this is meant to be kind of like a last minute. I literally decided to do this yesterday. So yeah. Yeah, I guess that's it for announcements. Announcements, again, if you guys are interested in learning networking stuff, there's a bunch of cool stuff on my channel. Feel free to check those out. If you have questions, in Fun City just asked, I have a Discord server. Actually, do you see that? Yep, it should be on the bottom right of your screen. You can reach me at pracnet.net/discord. That's my Discord channel. I'm in there fairly often. Feel free to ask questions if you have questions, and there's other folks in there that help out with networking type questions as well. Cool. And I think that catches us up on questions. Yeah, so I guess that's it. Thank you all so much for joining. If you guys enjoy this type of stuff, go and mention something in the comments or find me on Discord and let me know, and I can try to think about doing these more regularly and at different time zones to account for the different folks all over the world. Otherwise, I guess I will wrap it up. Again, if you want a kind of cohesive narrative about subnetting, check out subnetipv4.com. And otherwise, thank you so much for hanging out. Hope you guys found some enjoyment out of this. Cool. I think that's it. Yeah, I guess I'll wrap it up. So yeah, thank you for joining, and we'll catch you guys in the next stream, I suppose. Yeah, enjoy the rest of your day, guys. Take care.